Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, American Bullfrogs Are Bullies. My name is Maya, and I'll be your presenter this afternoon. Today we're going to learn about one of British Columbia's most successful invasive amphibians, why they pose such a challenge for our native wildlife, and what all of us can do to help prevent them from spreading. Whether you're joining because you're curious about frogs, interested in conservation, or just happen to stumble across this webinar, I'm really glad you're here. By the end of today's session, you'll know how to identify an American bullfrog, understand why they're considered invasive, and know exactly what to do if you ever spot one. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that I live, work, and play on the ancestral unceded territories of the Ktunaxa and the Secwepemc peoples, working with the Invasive Species Council. The East Kootenay Invasive Species Council has given me the opportunity to travel throughout this beautiful region, and I'm grateful to spend time learning about and helping care for these landscapes. Protecting biodiversity is something that benefits all of us, and it also means recognizing and respecting the deep connections Indigenous peoples have had with these lands and waters since time immemorial. Before we jump in, I just have a few housekeeping notes. If you're joining us on Zoom today, please keep your microphone muted and your camera turned off throughout the presentation. Feel free to ask questions at any point by typing them into the chat. I'll keep an eye on it throughout the webinar, and if we don't get to your questions right away, we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be uploaded to EKISC's YouTube channel, so you can watch it again or share it with others later. One more thing, we're not just going to sit and listen to slides today, we're actually going to have to play a quick frog identification game in just a few minutes. You'll have the chance to guess whether different frog species are native or invasive using the reaction buttons or by answering in the chat. No pressure. It isn't graded, but you'll definitely earn some frog bragging rights. Now that some introductions are out of the way, I'd like to properly introduce myself. My name is Maya, and I'm one of the 2 education and outreach assistants with the East Kootenay Invasive Species Council this summer. I grew up in Ontario, where I completed my degree in commerce. Although my education started in business, I've always had a passion for the environment, which has led me to begin a Master's of Science in Environmental Studies this September. I recently moved to the East Kootenays for this position, and it's been incredible getting to explore the region while learning about the amazing ecosystems and wildlife that make this area so unique. If you have any questions after today's presentation, or if you'd like to learn more information about anything we discuss, please don't hesitate to reach out using the email address on this slide. Here's a quick look at what we'll be covering today. We'll begin by talking about who EKISC is and the work we do throughout the East Kootenays. Then we'll take a step back and look what an invasive species actually is, because understanding that helps explain why American bullfrogs are such a concern. After that, we'll dive into everything bullfrog, including how to identify them, where they're found, why they're impacting native ecosystems, and the incredible work being done through the Kootenay Bullfrog Program. Finally, we'll wrap things up with a question and answer session where you're welcome to turn on your microphone or type your questions into the chat. Before we talk about bullfrogs, I'd like to introduce the organization behind today's webinar. The East Kootenay Invasive Species Council, or EKISC, is a regional nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing the environmental, economic, and social impacts of invasive species throughout the East Kootenays. Our work focuses on prevention, education, early detection, and coordinated management. That means we don't just remove invasive species. We also work with communities, landowners, local governments, Indigenous communities, industry, and recreation groups to stop invasive species from becoming established in the first place. Across the East Kootenays, we work with more than 200 invasive species, collaborate with over 35 funding and project partners, and coordinate invasive plant management across 5 management areas in the East Kootenays. Everything we do supports one shared vision: protecting the East Kootenays from invasive species. Because when we stop an invasive species early, we're protecting native plants, wildlife, recreation, agriculture, and local communities. Meet the EKISC team. Our team has a field operations team and an education and outreach team. In the field department, Connor manages internal work plans while Ashley coordinates with contractors and oversees external work. Nicola is responsible for long-term vegetation monitoring and supporting all facets of field operations. Our field operations crew, Jasmine and Ivy, are the boots on the ground who work to mitigate the spread of invasives. They conduct inventories to collect data on which invasive species are present in an area and implement treatments and controls using mechanical, chemical, cultural, and biological methods. The education and outreach crew, which I am a part of, works across the East Kootenays, hosting and attending community events. I'm grateful to work alongside Brittany, the Education and Outreach Manager, and Kyle, an Education and Outreach Assistant. We also work with school groups and summer camps, and we work to educate the public about invasive species. Katie and Megan support us in administration and keep everything running smoothly. Gabriella is responsible for grant applications, administers general program needs, and report writing, including the development of recommendations. Let's start with a simple question. What exactly makes a species invasive? A species isn't invasive simply because it comes from somewhere else. Many introduced species live alongside native species without causing significant problems. A species becomes invasive when it is introduced outside of its natural range and begins causing harm to the environment, the economy, or society. Environmentally invasive species can outcompete native species for food, water, and habitat. Some change entire ecosystems or introduce diseases that native wildlife have never encountered before. Economically, invasive species cost millions of dollars every year by impacting agriculture, forestries, fisheries, tourism, and even infrastructure. For example, Japanese knotweed has roots strong enough to damage pavement and building foundations. Socially, invasive species can reduce recreational opportunities and affect human health. Some invasive plants can cause painful skin irritation or burns, while others are toxic if eaten. So, when we talk about an invasive species, we're really talking about organisms that have impacts far beyond simply being new. Before we dive into American bullfrog specifically, I want to make sure we're all speaking the same language. There are a few terms that often get used interchangeably, but they actually have different meanings. Understanding these definitions will help make the rest of today's presentation much clearer. Let's start with a native species. A native species is one that naturally occurs in a particular region without human introduction. These species have evolved alongside other plants and animals over thousands of years and play an important role in healthy ecosystems. One example here in British Columbia is common yarrow, which is a beautiful flowering plant that provides food for many pollinators. Next is an invasive species. As we discussed on the previous slide, an invasive species has been introduced outside of its native range and causes harm to the environment, economy, or society. One example many of you may already be familiar with is blueweed, which has become an increasing concern in parts of the East Kootenays. You may also hear the term introduced species or non-native species. This simply means a species is living outside of its natural range. Importantly, not all introduced species become invasive. Some live alongside native species without causing significant impacts. A common example is the dandelion. While it wasn't originally native to North America, it doesn't meet the definition of an invasive species in British Columbia. Finally, let's talk about weeds. A weed is simply a plant growing where it isn't wanted. For example, if red clover starts growing on a golf course or soccer field, it may be considered a weed because it interferes with how that space is managed. So weed isn't necessarily invasive, and an introduced species isn't necessarily invasive either. It's all about the impact that species has on the environment. These definitions may seem simple, but they become really important when we're talking about management and conservation. Now that we have those key terms out of the way, I'd like to recognize some of the incredible organizations that help make our work. None of the work we do at EKISC would be possible without the support of our funding partners. Protecting ecosystems from invasive species is truly a collaborative effort, and we're incredibly grateful to work alongside First Nations, local governments, provincial and federal agencies, conservation organizations, industry partners, community groups, and many dedicated volunteers. Together, we currently receive support from more than 35 funding and project partners, and it's because of those partnerships that we're able to offer educational programming like today's webinar, coordinate invasive species management across the landscape, support research and monitoring, and provide resources to communities through the East Kootenays. On behalf of everyone at EKISC, we'd like to extend a sincere thank you to all of our partners for helping make this work possible. Speaking of partnerships, I'd also like to recognize someone whose expertise was invaluable in putting today's presentation together. Before we continue, I'd like to give a special thank you to Devin Moore. Devin is a wildlife technologist and the coordinator of the Kootenay Bullfrog Control Program. He generously took the time to meet with me, answer my many questions, and share his expertise on American bullfrogs and the work being done to monitor and control them here in British Columbia. Many of the photographs, examples, and information you'll see throughout today's presentation are based on conversations with Devin and the incredible work of the Kootenay Bullfrog Program. So thank you, Devin, for helping make this webinar possible. All right, enough listening to me talk for a moment. Let's see how well everyone knows their frogs. It's time for our first activity. We're going to play a quick game called Native or Invasive. Here's how it works. I'm going to show you a photo of a frog, one at a time. If you think it's native to British Columbia, give me a thumbs up reaction. If you think it's invasive, give me a thumbs down. And if you happen to know the species, feel free to type its name in the chat. Don't worry if you aren't sure. That's exactly why we're here today. I'll give everyone a few seconds to vote before revealing the answer. And if you're not sure where to find the reactions in Zoom, click the reactions button along the bottom of your screen. If you don't immediately see a thumbs down, click the 3 dots to find additional reactions. Are you ready? Let's meet our first contestant. Take a look at this frog. Do you think it's native or invasive? Go ahead and cast your vote now. Awesome. I'm seeing lots of great guesses. The correct answer is native. This is a western toad, one of British Columbia's native amphibians, and it's found right here in the East Kootenays. One of my favorite facts about the western toad is that although we often think of frogs and toads living in ponds, western toads actually spend about 95% of their lives on land. They only return to wetlands and ponds during breeding season before heading back into forests and grasslands. So even though they depend on wetlands for reproduction, they're actually spending most of their lives exploring the forest floor. All right, let's see if the next one's a little trickier. Here's our next frog, native or invasive. Go ahead and vote. This one here is the Northern Red-legged Frog, and it's also native to British Columbia. Unlike the western toad, this species isn't found here in the East Kootenays. Instead, it lives primarily along the coast, including Vancouver Island, the Lower Mainland, and the Gulf Islands. Here's a fun fact. Male northern red-legged frogs actually make their breeding calls from underwater, sometimes as deep as a meter below the surface. It's a pretty impressive way to communicate. All right, let's move on to our next guess. Here's our next contestant, native or invasive. Take a few seconds to make your guess. If you guess invasive, you're absolutely right. This is the American bullfrog, and although it's native to eastern North America, it does not naturally belong in British Columbia. We're going to spend the rest of today's webinar learning all about the species, but here's one fun, or maybe slightly disturbing, fact to get us started. American bullfrogs are cannibalistic. That means they'll even eat other American bullfrogs if given the opportunity. Like I mentioned earlier, they're not really picky eaters. And unfortunately, that's one of the reasons they've become such a successful invasive species. Let's see how everyone is doing. What about this little frog right over here? Is it native or invasive? This is the Pacific tree frog, and it's another native species found right here in British Columbia, including the East Kootenays. Even if you've never seen one before, you've almost certainly heard one. They're called the classic ribbit sound that's used in countless movies, TV shows, and cartoons. So whenever Hollywood needs a frog soundtrack, there's a pretty good chance they're using a Pacific tree frog. Despite being quite small, they're one of the loudest voices in many of our wetlands during the spring. Here's our final challenge, native or invasive. Go ahead and vote one last time. This one here is the green frog, and it's considered invasive in British Columbia. Its native range includes eastern Canada from Manitoba through Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritime provinces. One of my favorite facts about green frogs is their call. People often describe it as sounding like someone plucking a loose banjo string. It's such an oddly specific description, but once you hear it, I'm sure you'll probably agree. Although green frogs are invasive here, today's focus is on American bullfrogs because of the much greater ecological impacts they have on our wetlands. Now that everyone has officially completed Frog Identification 101, let's finish this section with a few fun facts about frogs. Frogs have been hopping around on Earth for more than 200 million years, which means they were around long before humans. Scientists have identified roughly 6,000 species of frogs worldwide, although new species continue to be discovered. Frogs were also the first land vertebrates to develop vocal cords, allowing them to communicate with one another using the calls we hear every spring. Many species are incredible jumpers, capable of leaping more than 20 times their body length. And finally, frogs are cold-blooded, or more accurately, ectothermic, which means their body temperature changes with the temperature of their surroundings. That's one reason why you'll often see frogs basking in the sun to warm up or hiding in cool, damp places during hot weather. Now that we've had some fun getting to know frogs, let's take a closer look at frog anatomy. Don't worry, there won't be a quiz. We're only going to focus on a couple of features that will make identifying an American bullfrog much easier later in the presentation. Now, let's quickly talk about frog anatomy. Now, don't worry, there will not be a frog anatomy exam at the end of this webinar. We are only going to focus on a couple of features that are especially helpful when identifying American bullfrogs. This diagram shows some of the different external features of a frog, including the snout, external nares, the tympanum, legs, toes, and other body structures. The two features I want everyone to remember are the tympanum and the dorsolateral folds. The tympanum is essentially a frog's external eardrum. It looks like a circular patch behind the eye and helps frogs detect sound vibrations. Dorsolateral folds are the raised ridges that run along the sides of a frog's back. These folds are an important identification feature because many of our native frog species have them, while American bullfrogs do not. So when you're trying to identify a possible American bullfrog, two questions to ask yourself are, does this frog have ridges running down its back? And how large is the eardrum compared to the eye? These simple observations can help distinguish American bullfrogs from some of our native species. Now that we know what features to look for, let's meet the frog that today's webinar is all about. Now let's meet the star of today's presentation, or perhaps I should say the villain of today's presentation. This is the American bullfrog, and it is the largest frog species found in British Columbia. American bullfrogs are native to eastern North America, where they naturally exist as part of those ecosystems. However, here in British Columbia, they are considered invasive because they were introduced outside of their natural range and cause significant impacts to native wildlife. Historically, American bullfrogs were introduced for several reasons. Some were brought in as a food source, some were introduced as a game species, and others were released into backyard ponds as ornamental animals. Unfortunately, what seemed like a harmless introduction created major ecological challenges. American bullfrogs are incredibly adaptable. They grow large, reproduce quickly, tolerate a wide range of conditions, and they have a very broad diet. Basically, they have all the qualities that make a species successful, but unfortunately, they are successful in places where they don't belong. American bullfrogs were first detected in the central Kootenays in 2015, which led to increased monitoring and conservation efforts in the region. As you can see from this image, they are not small frogs. A fun comparison, if our native frogs are the compact cars of the amphibian world, American bullfrogs are definitely the pickup trucks. American bullfrogs are not only large as adults, their tadpoles are also much larger than many people expect. American bullfrog tadpoles can grow up to 15 centimeters long, which is quite large compared to many native frog tadpoles. They have a distinctive arrowhead-shaped body and are often covered in dark spots, sometimes described as looking like black polka dots. One challenge with identifying bullfrogs is that people often notice the adults first, but monitoring tadpoles is also extremely important. Detecting bullfrogs early in their life cycle gives conservation teams a better opportunity to respond before they mature and begin reproducing. And because a single female bullfrog can lay thousands of eggs, catching them early makes a huge difference. So what does an adult American bullfrog look like? Let's take a closer look. Adult American bullfrogs are impressive animals. They grow between 18 and 20 centimeters long, not including their legs, and can weigh up to 800 grams. To put that into perspective, they can be about twice the size of many native frog species in British Columbia. There are a few key features that help identify an American bullfrog. First, they do not have dorsolateral folds. Remember those ridges we talked about on the anatomy slide? American bullfrogs have a smooth back without those raised lines. Second, they have very large circular eardrums called tympanums. Another clue is their overall size. If you see a frog that looks unusually large, it is worth taking a closer look. However, size alone is not enough to identify a bullfrog. Some native frogs can look similar, which is why learning multiple identification features is important. During breeding season, male American bullfrogs become even easier to identify. Their throats turn a bright yellow color, which helps distinguish them from females. Their overall coloration is usually a green to brown color with darker spots on their back, and they typically have a pale colored belly. This coloring helps them blend into their wetland habitats, especially around vegetation and slow-moving water. And while they may look impressive, remember that appearance alone doesn't tell the whole story. A frog can look interesting or even beautiful, but what matters is where it belongs and how it interacts with the ecosystem around it. Now, one of the easiest ways to identify an American bullfrog is not by looking at it, it's by listening. American bullfrogs have one of the most recognizable calls of any frog species. Their call is very loud, low-pitched. This call is actually where the species gets part of its common name. It sounds almost like a deep rumbling bellow rather than the traditional small frog ribbit sound many people imagine. Male American bullfrogs can be heard from up to 2 kilometers away under the right conditions. So if you're sitting beside a wetland at night and hear what sounds like a cow hiding in the bushes, it might actually just be a very confident frog. Their loud calls allow males to attract females and establish breeding territories. Now we're going to listen to an example of an American bullfrog call. As you listen, pay attention to how different it sounds compared to many of our native frogs. Rather than a higher-pitched chirp or repeated ribbit, the bullfrog call is much deeper, louder, and more like a low rumbling sound. It's a pretty impressive sound, but unfortunately hearing this call in British Columbia can be a warning sign that American bullfrogs may be present. Let's take a moment to look back at the frogs we saw during our identification game. We saw several species that can be confused with American bullfrogs, including the western toad, the northern red-legged frog, the Pacific tree frog, and the invasive green frog. One important thing to remember is that misidentification is very common. American bullfrogs can look similar to some native species, especially when people only get a quick glimpse of the animal. That is why photographs and location information are so valuable. If you think you may have seen an American bullfrog, don't worry about needing to be 100% certain. Take a photo, record when you saw it, and report it so experts can help confirm the identification. Now that we know how to recognize American bullfrogs, let's talk about where they live and why they are so successful. American bullfrogs thrive in warm, slow-moving water with lots of vegetation. They are commonly found in wetlands, ponds, lakes, reservoirs, and slow-moving sections of rivers. One reason they're so difficult to manage is their ability to move between habitats. Unlike some amphibians that stay close to breeding areas, American bullfrogs can travel over land and move through connected waterways. They also do well in human-disturbed habitats, including agricultural areas, backyard ponds, and modified wetlands. This adaptability is one of the reasons they have been able to establish populations in many areas of British Columbia. They're not just surviving in these environments, they are thriving. And unfortunately, their success comes with some serious consequences for our native wildlife. Now that we know where American bullfrogs live, let's talk about why they are considered such a significant invasive species. One of the biggest concerns with American bullfrogs is their appetite. American bullfrogs are generalist predators, which means they are not picky eaters. Basically, if it fits in their mouth, there is a good chance they will try to eat it. Their diet can include of native frogs, salamanders, young turtles, insects, small rodents, garter snakes, and many other small animals. This is a major concern because many of our native species did not evolve alongside American bullfrogs and have not developed ways to avoid them as predators. A wetland may look like a healthy ecosystem, but the introduction of a new top predator can create a ripple effect throughout the entire food web. And unfortunately, American bullfrogs are very good at filling that predator role. But predation isn't the only challenge. American bullfrogs also compete directly with our native amphibians. American bullfrogs don't just eat native species, they also compete with them. They compete with native frogs for important resources like food, shelter, and breeding habitat. One of the biggest advantages American bullfrogs have is their incredible ability to reproduce. A single female American bullfrog can lay up to 20,000 eggs in 1 year. To put that into perspective, many native frog species produce far fewer offspring. This high reproductive rate means populations can increase quickly if conditions are right. Once established, American bullfrogs can significantly reduce biodiversity by changing the balance of species within a wetland. They are considered a threat to many native amphibians, including British Columbia's Northern Leopard Frog population, as well as other wetland species like the western painted turtle. So when we talk about American bullfrogs, we're not just talking about one frog species, we're talking about the impacts they can have on an entire ecosystem. Another major concern with American bullfrogs is their connection to a disease called chytrid fungus. The scientific name for this fungus is Batrachochytrium dendropatitis. But because that is quite a mouthful, it is often shortened to BD. BD is an aquatic fungal pathogen that causes a disease called chytridiomycosis. This disease affects amphibians by damaging their skin, which is a very important organ for frogs because they use their skin to absorb water and exchange gases. One of the most concerning things about American bullfrogs is that they can carry BD without showing serious symptoms. In other words, they can act as a reservoir for the disease. This means they can potentially spread the fungus to native amphibians that may be much more vulnerable. Chytridiomycosis has contributed to declines in amphibian populations around the world, including impacts on the Rocky Mountain population of northern leopard frogs. So what happens when a native frog becomes infected with chytrid fungus? The fungus affects the frog's skin, causing it to become damaged and unable to function properly. The frogs may become weak, lethargic, and unable to regulate important processes like water balance and breathing. Infected frogs may also stop feeding because they become too sick to hunt. Eventually, the disease can become fatal. This is especially concerning because amphibians are already facing many challenges worldwide, including habitat loss, climate change, pollution, and other environmental pressures. Adding a disease like chytrid fungus creates another significant threat for already vulnerable species. An important thing to remember is that American bullfrogs are not bad animals. In their native range, they are actually an important part of the ecosystem. For example, in eastern provinces like Ontario, American bullfrogs naturally have predators and ecological relationships that help keep their populations balanced. Their predators include raccoons, largemouth bass, skunks, blue herons, snapping turtles, and northern water snakes. These predators, along with competition from other native species, help keep American bullfrog populations in check. The problem occurs when American bullfrogs are introduced into environments where those natural controls are missing, which brings us to British Columbia. Here in British Columbia, American bullfrogs do not have the same level of natural predators that they experience in their native range. While tadpoles may be eaten by fish, birds, herons, and other wildlife, there's not enough natural predation to control their populations. Combined with their ability to reproduce quickly, grow large, and eat a wide variety of prey, American bullfrogs can establish populations very successfully. Essentially, they arrive in an ecosystem where they have all the advantages. They have a large appetite, they reproduce quickly, and they don't face the same challenges they would in their native range. So where exactly are American bullfrogs found in British Columbia? Let's take a look at their current distribution. This map, created by the Sea to Sky Invasive Species Council, shows the distribution of American bullfrogs across the Pacific Northwest, including British Columbia. In BC, American bullfrogs are currently found in several areas, including the Lower Mainland, Vancouver Island, the Gulf Islands, and the Kootenays. One important thing to remember about invasive species is that populations can spread through connected habitats. Waterways, wetlands, and human movement can all contribute to the spread of invasive species. That is why early detection is so important. Finding a population early gives conservation teams the best chance to respond before it becomes much more difficult and expensive to manage. This map here shows both where American bullfrogs are currently established and areas where they may continue spreading. The darker orange areas show confirmed populations, while the lighter orange areas represent areas that may be vulnerable to future spread. I do want to point out that this map does not show every current detection. For example, American bullfrogs are present in the Creston area, even though that may not be reflected on the specific map. Maps like this are helpful because they show us the bigger picture. They remind us that invasive species don't recognize political boundaries or property lines. A frog does not know when it crosses from one management area into another. Looking more specifically at the Kootenay region, American bullfrogs have been detected in Nelway and in Creston. These populations are especially concerning because of their proximity to important habitats for native amphibians, including the Northern Leopard Frog. The Kootenay region is home to some incredibly important wetlands, and protecting these habitats requires collaboration between organizations, governments, landowners, and communities. The good news is that early detection and rapid response efforts have helped prevent further spread into some of these sensitive areas. Now that we understand where American bullfrogs are found, let's look at how they arrived in the Kootenays and what has been done to respond. Let's take a look at how American bullfrogs became an issue here in the Kootenays. This timeline shows how a few observations quickly grew into a coordinated conservation effort. It all began in 2013 when Angus Glass, a communications coordinator with the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, spotted American bullfrogs south of Nelway, British Columbia. This observation raised concerns because bullfrogs had not been previously documented in this area. In 2014, the Northern Leopard Frog Recovery Team and the Central Kootenay Invasive Species Society responded by installing acoustic monitoring equipment in Creston to begin listening for bullfrog calls. Then in 2015, the first American bullfrog was officially detected in the region. Just 1 year later, a second bullfrog was found, confirming that this wasn't simply a one-time sighting. By 2017, enough concern had been raised that the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program developed an early detection rapid response plan, recognizing that acting early would provide the best opportunity to prevent the species from becoming established. Then in 2018, the first confirmed American bullfrog breeding event was discovered in Creston. That was a major turning point. Finding breeding adults meant that the population was no longer made of just a few wandering individuals. It meant that frogs had begun reproducing and establishing themselves. This timeline really highlights the importance of monitoring. Sometimes conservation starts with just one observation, one report, or one person noticing that something just doesn't seem quite right. So why has Creston become such a high priority? Let's take a closer look. Today, American bullfrogs are established in the Creston area. The reason this is especially concerning is because Creston is home to something incredibly important. It contains the last naturally breeding population of northern leopard frogs in British Columbia. This makes this one of the highest priorities for amphibian conservation in the province. American bullfrogs spread through connected wetlands, agricultural ditches, and slow-moving waterways, allowing them to gradually expand their range. If left unmanaged, they have the potential to move farther north and into additional sensitive habitats. That is exactly why the Kootenay Bullfrog Program exists. Its goal isn't simply to remove bullfrogs, its goal is to protect one of British Columbia's most vulnerable amphibian populations before it's too late. When we talk about invasive species management, this is what we're really talking about, protecting native biodiversity before irreversible damage occurs. Since we've mentioned them a few times now, let's meet the species we're working so hard to protect. This is the northern leopard frog. Historically, northern leopard frogs were found throughout parts of southeastern British Columbia. Unfortunately, their populations have declined dramatically over time due to habitat loss, changes in water availability, disease, and other environmental pressures. Today, the only remaining naturally breeding population in British Columbia is found near Duck Lake in Creston. To help recover the species, conservation teams have developed a translocation program. This involves carefully collecting tadpoles from the Creston population and relocating them to suitable habitat near Kimberley in an effort to establish a second breeding population. Think of it as creating a backup population. Having more than one breeding population reduces the risk of losing the species entirely if something happens at a single location. It's a long-term conservation effort that requires years of monitoring and patience, but it provides hope for the future of this remarkable species. Now, let's compare these two frogs for a moment, because one number tells a very important story. This comparison really puts things into perspective. A female northern leopard frog typically lays between 2,000 and 4,000 eggs each year. That might sound like a lot until you compare it to the American bullfrog. A single American bullfrog can lay up to 20,000 eggs in one breeding season. That's roughly 5 to 10 times as many eggs. When one species reproduces this quickly, populations can grow very rapidly if conditions are favorable. It also means conservation teams have to work incredibly hard just to stay ahead of population growth. This is one of the biggest reasons why early detection is so important. Managing a few frogs is much easier than trying to manage thousands. And because bullfrogs don't stop at international borders, neither does the work to manage them. American bullfrogs don't recognize provincial, state, or international borders. They simply follow a suitable habitat. That's why collaboration is such an important part of invasive species management. The American Bullfrog Action Team brings together professionals from British Columbia, Alberta, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and other regions across Western North America. These organizations share research, monitoring techniques, management strategies, and lessons learned from their own programs. Rather than each organization working independently, they learn from one another to improve conservations across the region. It's a great example of how environmental challenges are often solved through partnerships, because invasive species don't stop at the border. Neither should conservation. The Kootenay Bullfrog Program officially began in 2018 as a collaborative effort between the Central Kootenay Invasive Species Society, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and the province of British Columbia. Since 2023, the program has been coordinated through the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program as part of the Northern Leopard Frog Recovery Program. This collaboration brings together experts in wildlife biology, invasive species management, monitoring, and habitat restoration. Managing invasive species is rarely something one organization can do alone. Successful programs rely on partnerships, shared knowledge, and long-term commitment. The Kootenay Bullfrog Program is a great example of what collaborative conservation looks like in action. The Kootenay Bullfrog Program has two primary goals. The first is to prevent American bullfrogs from establishing overwintering populations in Creston. If bullfrogs successfully survive in the winter and continue reproducing year after year, they become much more difficult to manage. The second goal is to support the recovery of northern leopard frogs by reducing the pressure created by invasive bullfrogs. Notice that the goal isn't necessarily to remove every single bullfrog overnight. Instead, the program focuses on reducing their impacts while protecting one of British Columbia's most vulnerable amphibian species. Conservation often happens one step at a time. So, is the program making a difference? The answer is yes. Since the Kootenay Bullfrog Program began, American bullfrogs have not become established in the breeding and overwintering habitats used by northern leopard frogs. This is a significant conservation success. It shows that early detection, rapid response, and ongoing monitoring can make a real difference. Success in conservation isn't always measured by completely eliminating a species. Sometimes success means preventing further spread and protecting the habitats that matter most. Every year, that northern leopard frogs continue breeding without bullfrogs becoming established in those key habitats is an important win. So how exactly does the team accomplish this work? Let's take a look behind the scenes. The Kootenay Bullfrog Program uses a variety of monitoring and management techniques throughout the year. In the spring, the team surveys wetlands to locate and monitor northern leopard frog egg masses. This year alone, they documented 8 egg masses, providing valuable information about breeding success. The team also works to protect those egg masses from potential threats while monitoring the surrounding habitat. Throughout the season, staff conduct surveys for American bullfrogs. When invasive bullfrogs are found, they are humanely removed from the environment to reduce their impacts on native wildlife. The team also monitors bullfrog population density, tracks changes over time, and uses acoustic recording devices to detect calling males during breeding season. All of this information helps guide future management decisions and allows the program to respond quickly if populations begin expanding. It's a great example of how science, monitoring, and conservation work together to protect native biodiversity. One of the coolest tools they use doesn't require anyone to stay up all night listening for frogs. Instead, they let technology do the listening. One of the most valuable tools used by the Kootenay Bullfrog Program is acoustic monitoring. Rather than having biologists sit beside wetlands every night listening for frogs, the team uses automated recording devices called song meters. These recorders are placed in wetlands and programmed to record between 8 p.m. and 1 a.m., which is when American bullfrogs are most active. The recorder operates on a schedule, recording for 30 minutes, then resting for 30 minutes throughout the evening. During most of the season, recordings are collected every 2 weeks. However, during breeding season, when bullfrogs are calling more frequently, the devices are checked weekly. This technology allows the team to monitor multiple wetlands at once without disturbing wildlife and provides an efficient way to detect bullfrogs, even if no one is physically present. It's a great example of how technology is helping conservation efforts become more effective. And all of this monitoring has produced some very interesting results. Monitoring doesn't just tell us where bullfrogs are, it also tells us where populations are growing or shrinking. In 2025, the Kootenay Bullfrog Program documented 1,321 American bullfrogs and successfully removed 782 of them. Those numbers alone show just how much work goes into managing this invasive species. But perhaps even more convincing is what they're seeing this year. So far in 2026, the program is on track to observe more than 3 times the number of bullfrogs compared to last year. That doesn't necessarily mean bullfrogs are suddenly exploding overnight. Increased detections can also reflect improved monitoring efforts and expanded survey areas. However, it does reinforce one important message. American bullfrogs continue to spread, and ongoing monitoring is absolutely essential if we want to stay ahead of them. Over the years, the Kootenay Bullfrog Program has tested a variety of creative techniques to detect and remove American bullfrogs. One of the most interesting methods involved a specially trained canine detection dog. This wasn't originally a wildlife detection dog at all. It was actually an avalanche rescue dog that was trained to locate American bullfrogs by scent. The dog helped survey the northern edge of known bullfrog populations to determine whether the frogs had spread farther than expected. In parts of the United States, conservation teams are now training dogs to detect bullfrog egg masses, which can be extremely difficult for people to spot. The program has also experimented with electrofrogging, which uses modified electrofrogging equipment to temporarily stun frogs in the water so they can be safely captured by trained professionals. Other techniques have included pitfall traps, airsoft rifles with non-lead pellets used by specially trained technicians, and different humane euthanasia methods as best practices have evolved over time. One thing I find really interesting about conservation is that it often requires creativity. Scientists are constantly testing new ideas, learning what works, and improving their methods based on experience and research. Now that we've learned about all of this incredible work, let's bring the focus back to home. American bullfrogs are established in Creston, and populations also exist just across the border in Montana. Because frogs don't recognize borders, there's always the possibility that they could continue spreading into new areas if they go undetected. This is why early detection is one of the most effective invasive species management tools we have. Finding just one bullfrog early can prevent an entire breeding population from becoming established. By monitoring wetlands, reporting sightings, and increasing public awareness, we can help protect native amphibians, wetlands, and biodiversity throughout the East Kootenays. As we often say in invasive species management, the sooner we find it, the easier it is to manage. Now, you might be wondering, what can I do? The good news is that everyone can help. One of the most important messages is don't let it loose. If you have pet amphibians or aquatic animals, never release them into the wild. Even if you are trying to set them free, releasing pets can introduce invasive species and diseases into natural ecosystems. You should also avoid transporting frogs, tadpoles, or aquatic plants between wetlands. And while backyard ponds can be beautiful, never stock them with non-native amphibians or frogs purchased through the pet trade. Finally, one of the easiest ways to help is simply by learning to recognize American bullfrogs and sharing that knowledge with friends and family. Awareness is one of the most powerful conservation tools we have. If you think you've seen an American bullfrog, don't worry if you're not completely certain. We would much rather receive a report that turns out to be a native frog than miss an important detection. If it's safe to do so, please try to take a clear photograph of the frog and make note of the location. You can then report your sighting using the Report Invasive BC app or website. You can also email EKISC with your photo and the location where you observed the frog. Those reports are incredibly valuable. Many invasive species are first detected because someone in the community noticed something unusual and took the time to report it. You could be the person who helps identify the next important detection. Before we wrap up, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to learn about American bullfrogs and the importance of protecting our native wetlands. Today we covered a lot of information, from invasive species basics to frog identification, conservation efforts, and what you can do to help. If there's one thing I hope you take away from today's webinar, it's this: early detection matters. Every report, every conservation, and every person who learns to identify invasive species helps protect the ecosystems we all enjoy. If you'd like to continue learning, I encourage you to follow EKISC on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, where we regularly share invasive species updates, educational resources, volunteer opportunities, and ways you can get involved. We'd love to have you join our community. Thank you again for spending part of your day with us. That brings us to the end of today's presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Feel free to either unmute yourself or type your question into the chat. No question is too small, and if I don't happen to know the answer, I'll do my best to connect you with the appropriate resources. Unfortunately, right now, I am unable to see the chat just because I'm sharing my screen. So if there are any questions, please turn on your mic.
Hey Maya, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome, great presentation. Megan here. Just a quick question. While researching and preparing for this, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about the American bullfrog, or what really stuck with you?
I think what stuck with me the most would probably be how, one, that they are cannibalistic. That was really shocking, but also at the rate that they reproduce, and that they are so close to such a vulnerable native species that the government is working really hard to protect. I'd say that was the most impactful from all the research.
Awesome, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. If those are all the questions, I'd just like to say another thank you again. And I have a few more slides of just my references. So the information presented today comes from a variety of scientific publications, conservation organizations, and monitoring programs, all of which are listed here in the reference section. I'd also like to once again thank Devin Moore and the Kootenay Bullfrog Program for sharing their knowledge and helping ensure that information presented today is accurate and up to date. Thank you all once again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks, Maya. Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maya.
Thank you so much.